Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Daily Standup. So I want to show you all how I have esbuild set up for my front end. So my front end is a React web application, and that's hosted in my .NET web app. So it's a .NET web application. That's the project template that I started from with my .NET solution. But then the front end, I'm just using React, and then serving up that bundled JavaScript file as part of my like the home index file that's served up from the home controller. So if I look at my views, you can see that it's just a traditional .NET MVC web application, right? So you should have I have a views folder, and then home folder, which corresponds to your home controller, and then the index file like you normally have. The one difference with this is that I've deleted a lot of like the Razor stuff, but then I have this, I added this div element here, and this div element basically is what I'm going to be using to, or I guess I should say what React is using to build its virtual DOM on, right? Because React works by creating not manipulating the DOM in a sense, but it's creating this virtual DOM on top of a specific element on the actual DOM. So this element here, this div, I have app as the ID, is basically where everything is going to be built as far as React goes. And then if I go to the React web application, if you've ever worked in React, this is basically this index file, or sometimes it could be called maybe app or whatever you have it called. You have to create the React root where the actual React project, the virtual DOM, is going to be rendered, and where you're going to be rendering all your components. So this here is, you can see that this name matches what I just showed you, so app. So this root is getting that div element, and then everything is going to be rendered on that element. So if you see here, root.render, and you pass in children, in this case the children is the app. The app contains everything, so it's like a nest on top of that virtual DOM. So that's one way of looking at React. So now that we kind of understand that, how that works is I'm using esbuild. Esbuild, if you're not familiar with that, is just basically a JavaScript bundler. It's really fast. If you've ever used Webpack, Webpack's not the fastest, especially on older versions of React. It takes a long time to build sometimes. esbuild's real quick, so if you've never tried it, I'll give it a shot. So yeah, you can look into that. And one of the things that it allows you to do is specify basically this bundle command. So basically you tell it, okay, this is my bundled file basically, and then you basically give it an output directory. So what you're telling it to do is saying, hey, take the bundled file and put it in this location. For me, the location, since it's in a .NET web application, is in the www root folder and the distribution folder. So that's here. So if I click into that, you'll see two files. So if I go to the index.js, this is all the React bundled code, all the JavaScript bundled code. And if you go back to here, that's exactly what we specified. So this that makes sense. And a couple things to note with this is that oh, let me stop this. I have it watching now. So I'm using Yarn as the package manager. But if we do yarn build, which again is going to run this script here, you can see that it bundles it and then puts it into that directory, which again is this file right here in my solution. And I have another command, so yarn and then start, which basically you can give it it's basically saying build, but also watch the files. So that way, if there's any changes, it'll basically recompile that and you can see it live on the front end. You do, if you're setting your project up this way, you do have to make sure that your .NET web app is your .NET solution is running, and then start up the front end, and then you should be able to, just work with your React app like you normally would. So everything's gonna be up and running like it normally would, and you can navigate and everything like that. So that's how I have the front end structured. A couple of other things I want to kind of call out about this is that I'm trying my very best to keep the dependencies to a minimum. Honestly, this is getting a little long for me personally, but why I'm trying to keep it to a minimum is that because if you've ever worked in a React project, Angular project, whatever front end framework you're working with that has managed dependencies like this, that it doesn't take long for these things to get out of date. And once they get out of date, it's like you're in like the doom cycle. So it's like your framework gets out of date. So it's like if we're 5, 6, 7 versions behind in React, that also means my dependencies are probably going to be out of date. But once those dependencies get out of date, you can't just go and update the framework because you probably will break your dependencies. So now you have to update the dependencies too. The problem with that is if you update the dependencies, the code associated with those dependencies probably has changed, and you probably have to make code updates. And sometimes the code updates you have to make might break some other area in the code, and that might conflict with another dependency. So it's just like, if you don't stay on top of updating everything every year at least, you're gonna head south real fast. Meaning like you're like you're not gonna be moving forward, which is bad, right? And it especially is bad if you work on it first, like your team makes the project, and then you guys all leave, right? All the devs leave, and then another set of developers comes in, gets the secondhand project. Now, they're just trying to figure out what's happening. They're not going to have a lot of incentive to go back and update this because they're trying to figure out, okay, how does this work? What does it do? And they're getting a list of enhancements and features that people want added to it. So they just add those to it, and it never gets updated. And then you inevitably get to that question of, okay, is it faster if we just rebuild this? And then you just start the process over again. So it's real important that you keep dependencies to a minimum if you can, because these things will break your application years down the road, right? So just a couple of the ones I want to call out are I'm using wter as the React as the router. If you're familiar with React router, that's like the go-to React or router for React. But wter offers a really unique option. One, because it's a super small dependency, but it's super easy to work with. So all you have to do let me try to find an example of this here. I need to go back to, so instead of, if you've used React router, one way you have to wrap everything around like a router. This, you can kind of get away with just specifying routes like this and telling it the component to render. So it's kind of lightweight there. Let me see, go to my home TSX file. You can see that I don't have to necessarily wrap the whole thing in a router. So that's kind of nice. I am using themes and a couple other things I have to wrap the app around in. So that's kind of nice. And there's other things about the dependency as well that's just kind of nice. But again, it's like super minimal. Not much can go wrong with it. I have a couple other things like esbuilds. I'm using Material UI. I'm using SignalR, and a couple other just style things that I have to have in here. But that's it. I mean, and then obviously the React, dependencies you need. And then I don't really have dev dependencies aside from just types because I'm using TypeScript. But that's it. And honestly, I don't really want to go beyond this because I just don't want to maintain that much more stuff. So if you've ever worked on a project that has a huge list of dependencies, you know that, at first when you make it, it's great because everything works, but it's like years down the road, it's just a nightmare to have to upgrade and maintain. I am using Yarn as the package manager, so I don't know, Yarn works pretty well. It's pretty fast. I don't really have many complaints about it. I'm trying to think what else. Let's see. Yeah, the build scripts are pretty standard. I don't really manipulate any of them except, honestly, the build for adding esbuild. I don't think I have any other Yarn configuration stuff that I have to show. But yeah, so that's kind of, I mean, that's really about it. I think the other thing you do have to make sure though is if you go to your program CS, so on your startup pipeline, just make sure that you have this being called, right? So use static files, because technically your React app is static, right? So I think that should be included by default. Just make sure you have that in there. I don't know if there's other ways to get around that. If you don't include that, let me know if you know of another way. Everything else though can be left standard. Just obviously make sure your controller routes are fine. And then yeah, so I think that's the only other weird thing. I already showed you how to render it on the. I already showed you how to render it here. But yeah, I think that's it. Obviously, but what this doesn't cover though is like overall deployments. So if you want to develop a strategy for building your React application first, then deploying your whole .NET application, that might not be a bad idea. So maybe in like a deployment script, you could specify to run yarn build first before your deployment. Might not be a bad thing to do. That's not included in this in what I showed you, so just something to think about, right? Because you want to make sure that when you deploy your application, you have the most recent bundled file in your distribution folder. So but yeah, so anyway, I think that about covers it for this one. Yeah, that's all I can think of right now. So yeah, anyway, I'll see you on the next stand-up.